Hello, everyone. My name is Jamille Pinheiro, and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the co-director of the Environmental Humanities Research Hub at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, which is part of the Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities series. Before we begin, I would like to thank Daniela Russ and Thomas Turnbull for joining us today, as well as my co-organizer, Gianfranco Selgas, for working with me to bring this event to life. Many thanks also to Annie Sherrod for her support, and of course to all of you for being here. The Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities series is dedicated to fostering interdisciplinary and transnational dialogues in this field. Please note that this session is being recorded. We will have a Q&A at the end. So if you would like to ask a question, please feel free to do so in the chat. In today's session, Energy's History Toward the Global Canon, Daniela and Thomas will introduce their recently edited book and explore how energy's history, a field that examines the ways humans have conceptualized, harnessed, and exploited Earth's energies, can challenge universalizing narratives of historical change. Their work highlights the diverse, situated paths of energy history, offering perspectives that go beyond Western capitalist models and providing a critical lens on how energy histories shape both past and present. I will now hand it over to my colleague Gianfranco, who will introduce our guest speakers in more detail, and I look forward to the discussion ahead. Thank you so much again, and Gianfranco, over to you.
All right, thank you, Jamille, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Thomas, for accepting the invitation. So we're delighted to open these terms, Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities, by welcoming Daniela Russ and Thomas Turnbull for their talk, Energy History Toward a Global Canon. Our speakers have made significant contributions to expanding the history of energy through geographical and social ecological perspectives. So I'm just going to say a few words about them before they can start the presentation. Daniela Russ is a historical sociologist and junior professor of global dynamics of resource use and distribution at the University of Leipzig. Her work explores the relationship between society and nature from a global perspective. Her forthcoming book, Work in Nature, Steam, Power, and the Failure of the Energy Economy, offers a historical account of the energy economy informed by a critical theory of nature. Her recent research examines the decarbonization of electric grids, the theory and practice of Soviet energy planning, and early Soviet ecological thought. Thomas Turnbull is a historical geographer and research scholar at the Max-Planck-Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. His research sits at the intersection of energy history, the history and impact of cybernetics, intellectual history, and historical geography. He has held visiting positions at Louvain University, Maastricht University, and KTH Stockholm, and has taught at Oxford, UCL, and St. Gallen. In addition to his academic work, he has experience in energy policy and has been involved in various art, outreach, and experiential education initiatives, including the Mississippi River Open School for Kinship and Social Exchange. Both Daniela and Tom, thank you, and welcome to Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities.
Thanks, Gianfranco. Thanks, Jamila. Thanks, Annie, for inviting us. We're going to sort of divide this up between us, so I'm going to start. And the book comes out on the 25th of March, and we got some pre-release copies, so this is the book. Ta-da! Yeah, and I'm going to kind of do a mix of reading and ad-libbing. So I'll begin by saying it's a truism among historians that history is written for a particular present. What historians look for in history, the meaning is never settled. Meaning mutates in step with an ever-changing future. So I think it's worth reflecting for a moment on what this means for energy history particularly, and what it means to speak of moving toward a global canon, as the subtitle of our book promises. In the 1950s, intellectuals debated the atomic bomb as a moment when the meaning of human history radically changed. Before and after the bomb, human history could not be written in the same way. Until then, human beings could take their own life or that of a few others, but not of humanity in total. But what if it cannot understand or govern? There is a gap between the actions that are possible and the ability to imagine the world that they bring about. Hence the unease, fear, anxiety of any single human being. In other words, the unity of humanity is only a negative one. It's one of a common threat, a power to destroy that does not in itself come with the power to manage, organize, and govern. So the shock of the Anthropocene is similar in that sense, the ability to control huge amounts of energy. One recent estimate is that humans have used more energy since 1950 than in the entire preceding 9,750 years of the preceding Holocene. That said, the successful manipulation of energy and the complex global infrastructure we have created in doing so is perhaps the largest interconnected piece of infrastructure humanity has ever created. And sadly, this doesn't translate into the power to govern the unwanted consequences of energy use, nor even to coordinate change from within this infrastructure, to phase out fossil fuels, for instance. This power forms a negative unity. The possibility to use massed energy to support abundant and complex life in ever greater numbers does not grant us the power to govern and restrain that power. Still, there are also differences that make the Anthropocene even more unsettling and, in a sense, more difficult to work through, both morally and historically. We argue that energy history should be understood as an ideographic form of history, something concerned with specific actualities rather than abstract generalities. Energy built a world for some, and it destroyed the worlds of others through particularly coal-powered colonialism. It catalyzed factories and plantations and extended the toil of workers. It propelled steamships along rivers and deep into colonial markets. It industrialized slaughter in global wars, and in the mid-20th century, the atom bomb rendered all life on Earth existentially uncertain. So our book starts from our globally fragmented, contradictory, and uneven present, from a present wherein high energy and fossil fuel use has become desirable and planet-spanning, but yet over 40% of Africans still lack secure access to electricity. This is a present where the largest fossil fuel consuming nation, China, is also the largest producer of renewable energy. Moreover, global climate politics is being developed in a historically antagonistic way. It places burdens on those who suffered the most under coal-powered colonial rule, and those who have yet to fully enjoy the developmental potential of fossil fuels. Beyond bromides about transition, we argue that meaningful change to our energy systems will occur only if we accept a pluralistic understanding of the relationship between energy and Earth's myriad societies. The IPCC's one-size-fits-all solutionism, overseen by doyens of the oil industry, is unsurprisingly not working. Energy's history offers a more variegated, complex story, which raises the primacy of the global south and unsettles the solidity of the coupling of energy equals progress in the global north. Our goal is a more accurate and cosmopolitan energy history, suitably informed by this understanding. Perhaps those making policy can take this into account. To quote from the book, rather than abstracting or reducing energy historical events to mere quantitative or grand systemic transitions, this volume gives insights into the many and diverse hopes and fears that constructed the present. In this book's introduction, we argue that energy is an idea that conveys a certain understanding of nature, work, and historical change. So energy history, like economic or demographic history, implies that the first term, energy, is an agent of changes that we might deem historical. Energy historians therefore study events that have been enabled, shaped, dominated, or determined by energy, or even energy's absence. This thing, energy, is also a concept, something historical. Despite its mid-19th century origins in Western European natural science, it is now spread planet-wide And despite this, the term had precepts in many societies, one of which Nayama will discuss later. The concept, energy, and the principles of growth and development associated with it have changed. They've wobbled, and they've impacted upon and been impacted by other thought systems, from politics to economics, religion, and cybernetics, to take a few examples. The scientific concept of energy as a measurement of a system's ability to do work, as a law of conservation, and as an inescapable tendency toward entropy, describe a set of physical possibilities and constraints within which past events can be understood, and through which certain historical actors understood their present. For instance, in the early 1900s, the North American historian Henry Adams presented energy as, to quote, the fundamental engine of historical change. Energy conversions, which are always imperfect, drive history, but they produce entropy in doing so. And as a result, to quote, the ash heap of history was for Adams constantly increasing in size. Other energy historians were more optimistic and perhaps more deterministic. For instance, the US anthropologist Leslie White, writing in the 1940s, argued that, quote, civilization advanced with increased quotients of energy. If the truth lies somewhere in the middle, should we leave history to physicists, those who explain everything in simply thermodynamic terms? If so, what happens to our discipline's commitment to historicize and specify? Climate change and its attendant dangers have caused a reassessment of the assumed coupling of energy use and social advancement. More energy may not always be a good thing. Added to which, the Anthropocene is best understood as an energy historical event. As we've already mentioned, it's been estimated that we, as a species, have used as much energy since 1950 as in the rest of the preceding Holocene. If then, as some geologists argue, humans have become the fundamental agent of Earth history, this has been enabled as a result of past energy use. We may say that both human history and natural history are mere subfields of energy history. But that doesn't mean we think we should leave the interpretation of past and future to geologists either. William Geordie, a critical biographer of Henry Adams and himself a historian, argued that he and fellow historians should be, quote, concerned with the path to entropy rather than the destination of entropy itself. These paths are many and varied, as this book shows. Historians are needed to tell these stories. To quote from the book, if the purpose of the volume had to be narrowed down to one argument, it would be that global energy history cannot be understood without reflecting on global intellectual histories of energy. So, energy's history focuses on specific concepts, people, ideas, worldviews, arguments, events and statements that record, critique, and inform the distinct energy histories that shape our current and manifold energy predicaments. Cosmopolitanism for cosmopolitanism's sake? No. Our hope is that the much-needed alternative energy future can be pursued in a manner that accounts for the specific circumstances and motivations that shaped our present energy reality. The qualifier towards, in the book's title, serves to recognize that the work of creating a more wide-ranging and thus representative energy history is ongoing.
So I have the pleasure to walk you now after Tom's introduction to the general kind of concept of the book, a little bit through the structure, and we've chosen 3 chapters that we would briefly present, and those are not our own chapters, so we will actually present other people's work. Here you can see the table of content, and we structured the book in 3 different sections. So the first 4 chapters are about what we call developmental energies. So those chapters are mostly on accounts that somehow reflect on energy and economic development. And most of those chapters also somehow call for an imitation of Western use of fuel and of industrialization. The second section is the next 4 texts, so from chapter 5 to chapter 8, which we call emancipatory energies. Those are accounts that focus on how emancipation, so post-colonial, socialist, but also emancipation of that works towards some kind of resource sovereignty can be achieved. So here we see, the idea of using energy for some kind of emancipatory purpose. And then the last 4 texts are about ideational energies, maybe the most interesting kind of term that we invented, which is mostly about contested concepts, ideas to think energy differently. So we have here a text on intellectual energies, mental energies. Laura Nader's text that Tom wrote is about the limits of energy studies. So here, those texts are all somehow working and challenging the classical energy concept, I would say. So each of those contributions consist of one primary source and then an essay that introduces the source and the author and contextualize it in the history of that country and the time. And I'm going to present now one text of each section. Okay, yeah, here you see that 12 contributors, and I'll present Jennifer Eklund's text, Michael Dobson, Giuliano Garavini's text, and Laura and Twagira's text today. So Jennifer Eklund's contributions opens the book with a piece on what could be called the largest and most successful renewable energy project. And contrary to what most people would expect, it can be argued that this project took place with the introduction of ethanol in Brazil. Eklund describes this as a story that, and I quote here, may inform contemporary moves toward a non-fossil energy economy in a manner both encouraging and cautionary. Eklund tells the history of Brazil's pro-coal program through the intervention of a sugarcane magnate, Maurílio Biagi Filho's The Ethanol is Ours, which was published in 1983 in a newspaper. And this is the source that has been translated. Because Brazil had only limited oil reserves, the state had been investing in sugar-based ethanol since the 1930s already. But as a response to the 1973 oil crisis, the sugar and the state's security interests got aligned to create pro-alcohol, an import substitution program that successfully integrated ethanol into Brazil's energy economy. So rather than importing oil, Brazil would use a distillate of sugarcane to fuel its transport sector. Concretely, the pro-coal program increased the mandated amount of ethanol mixed in the national fuel. So there used to be, a 5% mandate, but it increased in the 70s to a 20% mandate. And they even developed and subsidized an exclusively ethanol-fueled car, which you can see here in the background. By 1985, ethanol accounted for a third of the nation's car fuel needs, and it is estimated that the program potentially prevented around 14 billion liters of gasoline from being burned. So this is how it could be called successful. But Eklund's text also shows how alternative energies have alternative costs and ambivalent outcomes. Because alcohol distillation produces 10 to 16 liters of a liquid byproduct called vinasse for every liter of ethanol produced. And this byproduct was by the producers of ethanol usually just dumped into the environment of the factories. But vinasse is a phosphate-rich form of pollution that asphyxiated fish and destroyed aquatic flora. But there's also a second environmental consequence of ethanol production, because since the 1970s, it was no longer just, absorbing a surplus of agricultural production of sugarcane, but it actually, had a feedback on production and increased production and land use. So there were now vast sugar plantations that contributed to the deforestation of the Amazon, Lavarado, and other regions. So lastly, as a last consequence, or kind of way in which this program also backfired environmentally, it can be argued that as a fuel that acts as a supplement to petroleum, ethanol has helped increase society's dependence on individual transportation. So Eklund's conclusion is quite ambivalent in the end. The second chapter that I wanted to present is Michael Dobson's and Giuliano Garavini's introduction to the petroleum pentagon. This is part of the emancipatory energies section, and it outlines what can be argued as the most consequential and anti-colonial approach to energy in the 20th century. They, by revisiting the life and work of Venezuelan economist and oil minister Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, Dobson and Garavini show how this little-known thinker set out a plan by which oil-producing states, and at that time often colonized and subject to exploitative oil extraction agreements, concessions, could regain a sovereignty over their oil. By doing so, Pérez Alfonso thought they could lead the world into a more balanced and conservationist relationship with oil. Dobson and Garavini term this the invention of anti-colonial democratic oil conservation. And as they note, its most important outcome was the creation of OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, which would have later a dramatic role in the energy history of the second half of the 20th century. The authors describe the influence of Pérez Alfonso's time in the US, where he learned about the US policy of pro-rationing, controlling the rate of petroleum extraction to ensure the full realization of its economic value and to ensure its conservation. The article sets out the main argument in Pérez Alfonso's book, The Petroleum Pentagon, from 1967, and this is also the source that is translated here. The book itself sets out 5 angles or policies by which petroleum might be more equitably, profitably, and sustainably be made use of. And I'm going to present here only one of the angles. One of the angles is that he called for a coordinating commission for the conservation and commerce of hydrocarbons. And the catchy acronym CCCCH was explicitly modeled on US pro-rationing policies, which had been first developed in Texas. And those policies restricted the supply of oil on the global market. This organization later inspired the formation of OPEC, wherein certain oil-producing nations agreed to coordinate and conserve their petroleum resources via price rises. But this power, as we all know, could then also be used for other means, as when a smaller group of Arab OPEC members imposed an oil embargo on the West in 1973. So in setting out the anti-colonial and conservationist origins and really showing how they two go together, the authors highlight how control over energy has not only been a force for imposing colonialism, but also it has provided a means for its resistance. The last chapter I just wanted to give a quick look into is Laura and Wagira's paper on in the section on ideational energies, and here we have also a different kind of source because it's a poem that she herself translated, if I understand correctly. So Laura and Wagira here expands on the idea of vernacular understandings of human energy in a place that has not yet been industrialized. And this invites us to reflect on whether there's something universal about the human problems energy-like concepts refer to. So it might be labor, hunt for warmth, nutrition. At the same time, Wagira finds that while these concepts refer to common human activities, they are already gendered in the text that she finds in those folk tales. Wagira's chapter presents a folktale from Sudan, today Mali, called 3 Rapid People, which was recorded by an interpreter in the early 20th century. The story concerns Nyama, which Tom already mentioned. This is a term used by Mande people, a large West African linguistic group, which was variously affiliated before colonization. So Nyama has been translated as a source of action or the power source behind every movement. Could also be that it's a force that animates everything that happens. So from shooting a musket or boiling millet, those are activities that appear in the poem. These kind of activities express Nyama, and the collective noun Nyaman or I don't know how to pronounce it really, is thus akin to energy. In the story, domestic tasks, so preparing and cooking millet, are done with an ease and speed that defies the laws of energy. The story also emphasizes the distribution of labor according to gender and the different roles each gender were expected to play, even in this kind of fantastic kind of setting. The tale is a part of a seemingly global genre that could be called power fantasies, from cocaine to the singularity, where many cultures have imagined situations in which energetic limits no longer apply. Togira argues that the story would have resonated at a time with local Bambara people as they were experiencing the incursions of French colonialists who had placed strains on food and fuel supply during World War I, and afterwards when the wood-hungry steam power arrived. The Sudan had not been a timeless energy-using community before colonization. This is also what this poem shows. Productive food supplies had been a long-standing achievement in the Senegal Valley, where the Wolof Kingdom had created a large-scale system of millet farming and collection. The superimposition of colonial appetites on this infrastructure no doubt lent the story a certain poignancy for the audiences for whom it was performed. So Nyama then is not just a curiosity, but it suggests a certain kind of coherence, or perhaps even the possibility of a reconciliation between the energy concept and other energy-like concepts, that could point the way toward a greater cosmopolitanism and perhaps the refinement of the Western concept. Okay, so I think I'm a little bit over time, but I would wrap it up with saying that we sadly don't have time to go into all chapters, but we're happy to speak about any chapter that you're particularly interested in. We also had before questions about why we use the word canon. And the book's idea of a canon is less, dogmatic and strict, but more the idea of a growing and contesting and ever-shifting set of texts with different kinds of events and protagonists that is, in a sense, living, and other texts could be added to it. As such, we understand the book itself not as finished, but also as an invitation for others to add to it, to disagree with the text that we've chosen, at least partly. We're also not free in choosing the text, or not entirely free, and provide their own sources and contextual essays. So we're currently also working on a course at Leipzig in the winter semester, where we might use the book as a tool for teaching and encourage students to find their own sources and write little essays on them. So in that spirit, we would also, in discussing the book, we're also already always happy to, ask people whether from their own research they could think of texts that are kind of neglected or important in certain kinds of fields, but are not accessible to others in other languages, and they could add it to such a collection. Yeah, that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela and Thomas. That was fantastic. This volume is certainly a really important contribution to the global intellectual histories of energy, and makes a really strong case for the need for a more wide-ranging and representative energy history. And it was fascinating to hear how the contributors have employed a range of methods, a range of interdisciplinary approaches to foreground this situated nature of energy histories across various regions and traditions. And just to kick off the conversation, I'm going to ask a broad question, so feel free to engage with it as you prefer. I would love to hear more about the process of developing this volume. So I was wondering, what were the main challenges you faced in assembling such a globally expansive and methodologically diverse collection? And again, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thanks, Jamila. What were the problems we faced? I would like to have kept tabs of how many of the contributors, including ourselves, got COVID multiple times in the process of writing this book. So we got an IAS, Independent Social Research Foundation, small grant to do this project, and we have originally envisioned everyone coming to Berlin and us sitting in a room and workshopping all the essays. But in the end, we transferred that all to Zoom. And the sort of cosmopolitanism of it was also not as cosmopolitan as perhaps we had hoped, which is a reflection, I think, of certain privileges that some have, and accessibility to sources and resources and free time to present work. So some of our contributors weren't able to bring their projects to conclusion, so sadly weren't able to be present in the final volume. There was a kind of absence of focus on the Middle East region, perhaps, which is heavily represented in the energy history canon anyway. So we were kind of okay with that. But retrospectively, I think I speak for us both when I say we wish we'd had something from a Palestinian perspective in this volume. But one, if I can tell a funny-ish story, is that one of the challenges related to the access to sources. So some sources you had to pay royalties for, some sources the authors had died within a sufficient time period so that we could kind of work out the copyright laws in that specific country. But in Michael and Juliana's chapter, we wanted to reproduce parts of an OPEC translation. So the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, who are headquartered in Vienna. And we had a long back and forth with their press officer, who was very unkeen on us using their source. And we were really worried that chapter was going to be cut from the book because we didn't have the rights to use the primary source for a long time. And then at some point, via personal connections, we got a letter from the from the Secretary General of OPEC, giving us permission to use it. So I never thought that we'd be kind of interacting with the highest authorities in OPEC in the process of writing this book, but we're very glad that we were, because we think that chapter is a really important contribution. So that was a long answer to your question.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Do you have anything to add, Daniela? Or
yeah, I would maybe add. I think as a we have more English-speaking texts now that we wanted to have, which is also connected to funding for translations, for instance. So most of the authors would have had to translate it themselves, which can be difficult or just time-consuming. So I think a lot is, in this sense, it was connected to money that was limited, I would say.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is really copyright, and not only copyright in the sense that it was important to get, but I think it's part of that glow, like my text, for instance, was just an institution from the 1920s that doesn't exist anymore. So who would even, in a socialist state? So, what is even the legal form, and does if considered from the US, does the rights holder of that text even know that he or she has the right? So those are the kind of questions that come up with sources that would be interesting, but are in such different kinds of legal and historical context. I think those were and also those were interesting challenges, because I think it goes to the heart of the matter in a sense. It goes to the problem of really making it global.
Interesting and annoying.
Yes.
in both measures. We had a handwritten permission slip from an Indian publisher, and our publisher didn't really like that, and so there was a lot of back and forth about what kind of document constitutes the right form of legitimating the reproduction of a text.
Yeah.
So many problems.
Thank you, Tom and Daniela. I think it was fascinating. I mean, I was lucky enough to listen to a previous book talk Tom gave at KTH. What was that, like maybe last year, I guess. And I didn't know about what you were mentioning this way you ended up organizing, in a way, I guess, the book with these like developmental energies, emancipatory energies, and ideological or ideational energies. Was like something missing there? Any other type of energies you wanted to include in that type of classification, or how did that, happen in a way?
I would even say it's not only that things are missing, but also that texts overlap. You could easily read Jennifer Eaglin's text also as an emancipatory text if you take the import substitution seriously. So it is, I think it's still a good way to organize the book. I wouldn't use them in a conceptual way for other texts necessarily. I think there's still something especially in the text, the differences between Victor, Shell, and Antoine's, and then what Liz writes, like the difference between those that really we just need access to coal to have the same kind of industrialization, to other texts that say we want to build another kind of energy economy, a more equal one. Like there's a real difference in the text, I think, that we can see. But it's not, not all texts are so clear. Some you can read differently. But I think the ideational is more clear to me. I think that's a real difference to most of the other texts, I would say. Whether there's another category missing, I don't know, maybe you have thought on that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of category. That's why we describe the canon as like this volatile canon. It's something that is changing all the time. It's something that can fall apart. It's something that can explode. It's something that can be built up. And so I think, yeah, definitely there could be other chapters added. We had originally thought of calling the book Alternative Energies in a kind of, not in the sense of wind power and solar or whatever, but as in the sense that there's alternative conceptions as to the developmental potential of energy. One thing that was very important to us was that this simple idea that kind of energy meant colonialism had to be kind of challenged, because for much of the 20th century, for second world and developing nations or underdeveloped nations, energy was seen as a means for emancipation. And I think that was really something that we wanted to get across. So yeah, I think there's many other directions we could have gone into, and it would have been nice beyond Jennifer and perhaps the NADA chapter 1 and 11 to look a bit more into alternative forms of energy, or chapter 4 by Antoine looks into conservation a little bit. So kind of diversifying the objects of analysis would be good, I think. But yeah, as we say, it's a living canon, hopefully.
Yeah, now that you mentioned that about like energy as a means for liberation, the case of Venezuela, I'm from Venezuela, so I know very well, what Garavini and Dobson are talking about in that book. Now I'm thinking about, and this is just like, I guess, like a reflection about what's happening today with Trump and this idea of, drill baby drill, right? This need to enhance kind of energy nationalism in a way. Is there anything we could say, like about that? I'm just saying, like, this resurgence of energy nationalism, with these policies that are in a way prioritizing some kind of energy dominance, right? Through increased oil and gas extraction now in the US, and what happened now with this reinvestment on fossil fuels and gas extraction, right? How do you see these? Again, this is just like a reflection, I guess. It's kind of a form of fossil fuel nationalism shaping contemporary global energy politics. What are the contradictions sitting there between what these chapters say and what is happening today? There's a continuity, a disruption. I don't know. Just guessing about this.
Yeah.
One thing is that I think the present is really like the present in which those texts were written. I think the newest one from the 1980s is a very different from today. So in all of these chapters, to increase the consumption of energy and mine coal and burn it meant something different than it means today. So I think this is one thing why there's no easy connection. And I'm just thinking whether we do have really nationalistic texts, but not really, I think. We definitely have, we definitely have texts that there's a lot about the state power and even the ability to form a state and to reproduce it is somehow dependent on having access to energy. But a lot of it is against the threat of, in the case of my text, against the threat of capitalist countries. In others, like Shellens, against imperial powers that might want access to that code. So it's hard to say whether the national is coming in those texts kind of originally or whether it's kind of a response to something external.
Yeah, I think that where there are nods towards nationalism, it comes perhaps from unexpected sources like mining engineers or those looking to promote the electrical industry. Most of these are not pronouncements by politicians rather than Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso. But yeah, it's a kind of, some of the sources are quite prosaic, but I think they do speak to this kind of new resource nationalism, new geopolitical sort of period that we're in. And I think you could really, in the vein of thinking of this as an expanding project, you could think of something like the degree to which now the sort of critical resource is maybe not coal or oil, or maybe it is behind all of that. But it's, if you think of the new DeepSeek AI and the controversy between China and the US with regard to this, and energy is central to that, because the DeepSeek AI allegedly was much more energy efficient than the US developments, but it actually then relied on US made chips. So the chip war is kind of underlying a lot of these discussions. So I think I hope it resonates with the kind of diversity of geopolitical kind of machinations that's going on at the moment. I don't think there's ever clear winners and losers in these stories. I think everyone is always competing and also collaborating with each other at different scales.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have some questions that kind of expand on the things that you have already said and the questions that Gianfranco asked. One of them is like, after the journey of editing this volume, the gaps that remain in the field of energy history that you hope other colleagues or future scholars will address. You have partially touched on that as well. And I was thinking about how you had to navigate different editorial cultures, or how to build bridges between different editorial cultures as part of the challenges that you faced in editing this. And I think a related question would have to do with how humanities scholars, historians can further integrate indigenous, non-Western, historically marginalized or minoritized perspectives to construct a more representative global energy canon. I think that it would be interesting to hear some of your insights about that. And the last question that occurred to me has to do with public engagement. What role can a volume like this play in the process of offering historical interdisciplinary insights into, bringing these insights into public discourse and policymaking even? Yes.
On the first question, I almost thought you probably know more about this than we do. No, I mean, I actually thought we should have, hired you as a kind of someone who could, because I think we stumbled into it. We weren't aware of it before, that it would be that we would have problems with sources.
Well, I mean, you have a lot of problems with sources in your geographical focus.
Yeah, but not necessarily indigenous. I think the sources, Jamille, you were talking about is more, I, for instance, I would have loved to have a chapter on firewood. And there it's even really, it's difficult to even have, it's a non-commodified, I mean, not always, but it's not commodified in the way electricity is, and it's not recorded in a way because it doesn't have the kind of institutions that account for it. And those kind of, those are even deeper kinds of challenges, I think, to find material that you could even present in a history on firewood. and I don't feel that I have an answer of how to do it. We had some, I think you have to be creative about sources. And if we could do it again, I think I would try to think more about that. We could have, pictures of a firewood production process or something. It doesn't have to be a textual source necessarily. And we did have a comic, for instance. We did have in the text that in the end didn't make it because they were not delivered. We had one interesting source that was a children's book. It was a comic for children promoting a certain kind of project. So we did have more diversity in the sources than we have now. But I think this would definitely be one way to go, to accept pictures, material. Maybe
in a way that could be a visual history as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, we encouraged contributors to propose all kinds of sources. And Laura Ann's folktale, I think, is a good example of that, but that depended on her ability to translate Bambara French and translate that all into English. So it depended on her language skills, it depended on her time. And, she's a professor, so she had the resources to do that. So I do think it is in part about resources as well. We want to kind of, we developed this idea of vernacular thermodynamics because we, in this project and in other projects, have come across concepts in indigenous cultures that are very similar to thermodynamics, but have perhaps aspects in them that are similar to sustainability. So I've been working on an Arizonan tribe called the Tohono O'odham that live in the Sonoran Desert, the sunniest place in the US, one of the driest places, and they have their own vocabulary about energy. And I think recording those is really important. So perhaps it's also about working with those people, working with anthropologists that have made written resources about those people. But I think, I think that would be, if there was a second volume of indigenous perspectives on energy and society, that would be a great thing.
Yeah, that would be a great contribution. I think any colleagues listening to us are interested in taking this forward, like a lexicon, a vocabulary of sorts, a dictionary of indigenous concepts related to energy. I think that would be a fascinating work to read.
Yeah, and it kind of, sorry, just to say your second question about outreach and public impact. At some point, we discussed the idea of, but this is fundamentally we think a teaching book is good for teaching, it's worth reading, but it's also good for teaching. And we envisioned a kind of online repository for essays and sources so that people don't have to wait for the publication of a book, but people can teach the book to whatever kind of audience they like, and that you can ask that audience, okay, what is an important energy historical source from your perspective? And, then add a commentary to that and upload it somewhere so it's publicly available. I think that's kind of one way in which we saw this idea of a volatile canon actually being actionable rather than just something written about in this book.
Amazing. Yes. And Gianfranco, do you have any other questions? And if other colleagues want to join us?
If there's someone in Zoom that wants to ask something, we still have at least 10 minutes left. So there's a chance to ask 2 more questions or 1 long question, if you like.
Should we stop share the screen so we see everybody?
Yes.
Want to open up the camera?
Feel free to.
I don't understand how Zoom works.
Oh, yeah, I should be. Okay. Fine. But I don't know where we.
But
Did we stop sharing the screen? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you did. Yeah. Now I keep thinking about the idea of a global canon and how you navigate this tension between expanding the scope of this energy history and avoiding the reproduction of exclusions and hierarchies. And based on what you've shared, I think, yes, you did an excellent work in navigating that tension, right?
Yeah, we get asked about the canon term quite a lot because it is associated with the idea of like the great books that of Western civilization, something like that. And that we use that term in order to kind of deconstruct it a little bit and open it up and say, well, yeah, but it's not a kind of obdurate canon that lasts for all of history. It's a canon that we want to be challenged and to grow. And so that's the aim. But yeah, there was a whole debate within geography, which is the discipline I come from, in around 2015 about whether there's any point in having a canon, or whether a discipline as kind of with such a terrible history as geography has the right to have a canon. And I kind of borrowed that idea about this kind of pluralistic canon from earlier debates in geography.
And again,
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, the way I also, since I'm teaching now quite regularly, the way I think about it is also that when you teach, you have to select texts constantly. So it's not a canon in the sense that you can impose it on, like your whole discipline or something, but you constantly choose the text that you think kind of define a field or a problem or something. So this would also be, if you teach on the global history of energy, then you need other kinds of sources than are available now. So this would be one small contribution to it.
Thank you. Yeah, I was gonna ask. Maybe this is the last question. But I don't know if I can't remember now. If Tom, you mentioned why you decided to call the book "Energy's History" and not "Energy Histories." Or there's a really interesting debate you guys present in the introduction when you talk about that. So could you just maybe as a closure mention that?
Yeah. I mean, so I think Daniela probably agrees with me, there's a distinction between energy history and the history of energy. The history of energy is the history of the concept of energy and its different kind of instantiations in different places and at different times. And then energy history is the idea that energy itself has a certain historicity. It causes change over time. And by having the kind of energy's history, the possessive, we're trying to say that there's energy history, but there's also the way in which the concept of energy, emerged in the middle of the 19th century. Before that, there was kind of proto-thermodynamic concepts. And that emerged in Western Europe and spread elsewhere, and it was modified as it came into contact with different cultures, or it modified those cultures it came into contact with, and it modified in relationship to different disciplines like statistical mechanics, like cybernetics, like economics. So I think it's that idea that the concept itself, the ability to do work in a given system, is something that is both a historical object and is something that has changed over time.
Perfect. Thank you, guys.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much, Daniela and Thomas. It's been a pleasure to listen to your insights and learn more about energy's history. Today's conversation has offered so much to reflect on, and I hope this conversation continues in other shapes and formats. But yeah, before we wrap up, I just wanted to invite everyone to keep following the Environmental Humanities Research Hub website for updates on our program of events. The Critical Conversations in Environmental Humanities series continues. And we are looking forward to having you in other conversations in the future. Thank you so much, Gianfranco, for bringing this to life with me. And see you all next time.